Here is a pattern that should not exist, and yet it does. Go to ancient Mesopotamia, and you find people terrified of invisible beings that lurked in the air and the doorways, controlling human fate, demanding to be appeased. Go to Egypt, and you find an afterlife guarded by hostile powers that block the soul's path and must be named and answered to be passed. Go to the Greeks, and you find a cosmos where lesser powers govern the space between earth and the divine, intercepting what rises. Go to the Gnostics, and you find the archons, the rulers, spiritual authorities stationed in the heavens whose job is to keep human souls trapped below. Go to the writings of Paul in the New Testament, and you find principalities and powers, rulers of the darkness of this age, spiritual forces in high places. 4 continents of thought, different languages, different gods, different centuries, and underneath all of them, the same haunting intuition, appearing again and again in cultures that had limited or no contact with one another. That the space between human beings and the ultimate divine is not empty, that it is occupied, that it is ruled by intermediate powers who are not entirely on our side, who stand between us and the highest reality, and who have some interest in keeping us where we are. Why would so many separate cultures across so much of the ancient world independently arrive at the same fear? That is the question this video is built around, and there are only a few possible answers, and every one of them is unsettling in its own way. Let us build the pattern first, culture by culture, and only then ask what could possibly explain it. Because the pattern is the evidence, and it is far more widespread than most people realize. Start in Mesopotamia, the oldest civilization we have detailed records for. The Mesopotamians lived in a world crowded with intermediate spirits. There were the Utuku and the most feared class, the 7 evil spirits, malignant powers who moved through the world causing disease, misfortune, and death. There were beings like Pazuzu and Lamashtu, terrifying entities that had to be warded off with amulets and incantations. But the crucial point is the structure of their fear. Ordinary people did not primarily fear the high gods. They feared the swarm of lesser powers in between, the spirits of the air and the threshold, who intercepted human life and had to be constantly managed, appeased, and warded against. The Mesopotamian world was one where the space around you was full of ruling powers with their hands on your fate, and almost none of them had your interests at heart. Move west and south to Egypt. We have already seen on this channel how the Egyptian afterlife was a gauntlet of guarded gates, each with a hostile keeper who had to be named and answered. But it went further than the afterlife. The Egyptians saw the cosmos as a fragile order constantly under threat from the forces of chaos, embodied above all in the great serpent Apophis, who attacked the sun god every single night as he traveled through the underworld, and who had to be fought off again and again, or the world itself would end. The Egyptian universe was one of perpetual siege, where hostile powers pressed constantly against the order of things, and where the passage of the soul was blocked by beings who had to be overcome through knowledge and ritual. Again, the same shape. The path to the divine and the stability of the world itself, obstructed by ruling powers who work against the light. Now go to Persia, and the pattern sharpens into something almost systematic. The ancient Persian religion of Zoroastrianism divided all of reality into a cosmic war between a good god of light and truth, and a hostile power of darkness and deceit, who commanded an army of malevolent spirits, the devas, dedicated to corrupting creation and leading human souls astray. Here, the intermediate hostile powers are not a random swarm, but an organized force, an opposition army under a dark commander, arrayed specifically against the good and against the human soul's journey toward the light. The idea of ranked, organized spiritual rulers working as a coordinated hostile power reaches one of its clearest ancient forms in Persia. Now, go to Greece. On the surface, the Greeks had their bright Olympian gods, but underneath, in their actual religious practice and philosophy, they had a rich and often anxious belief in daimones, intermediate spirits that stood between gods and humans, filling the space between earth and heaven. Some were neutral, some helpful, but many were feared, and later philosophers in particular developed the idea that the lower air was thick with these intermediate powers, some of them malevolent. who interfered in human affairs and stood between the soul and its ascent to the higher realm. The Greek philosophical cosmos, especially in its later forms, placed a whole population of ruling intermediaries in the sky between the human being and the pure divine above. Now travel further east than most surveys of this idea ever go, to ancient India, because the pattern reaches there too. In the Indian traditions, the material world is described as a realm of illusion, Maya, that veils true reality and keeps the soul bound to an endless cycle of death and rebirth, and that binding is not left unguarded. There are the asuras, powerful beings often opposed to the gods of light, and more broadly there is the entire machinery of the cosmos that keeps the soul trapped in the wheel of rebirth, life after life, unable to escape into liberation. The specific images differ from the Mediterranean ones, but the underlying shape is unmistakable. A soul trapped in a material world of illusion, held there by cosmic forces whose entire spiritual goal is to break free of the powers that bind it and escape the cycle to reach the true reality beyond. The trap, the binding powers, and the longed-for liberation appear once again on the far side of the ancient world. And there is a strange detail that recurs across several of these traditions, specific enough to be worth pausing on. The number 7. The Mesopotamians feared the 7 evil spirits. The Gnostics described 7 ruling archons governing 7 planetary spheres that the soul must pass through. Later Jewish and Christian mystical traditions counted 7 heavens, each with its own gatekeepers. Again and again, the ruling powers between earth and the highest divine are counted in 7s, often mapped onto the 7 visible moving lights in the sky, the sun, the moon, and the 5 visible planets, which ancient people watched wandering against the fixed stars and understood as the thrones or spheres of ruling powers. The idea that there are 7 ruling authorities layered above us, tied to the 7 wandering lights, appears across multiple separate traditions, which is a very specific convergence to arrive at by chance. And now bring it all together in the world where these currents met, the Mediterranean of the first centuries, and watch the Gnostics and the New Testament writers draw on this entire inheritance at once. The Gnostics gave these ruling powers their most systematic and most chilling form. They called them the archons, a Greek word meaning rulers or authorities. In the Gnostic vision, the archons are the powers who govern the material cosmos under the ignorant demiurge, and they are stationed in the heavens, at each level between the trapped human soul below and the true divine light far above. Their function is explicit and terrible. They exist to keep souls from rising. They guard the gates of the spheres. They demand that the ascending soul account for itself, and they seek to turn it back, to keep it trapped in the material world they rule. The whole Gnostic drama of salvation is the soul learning what it needs to know to get past these rulers and rise beyond them to its true home. And then, sitting right there in the mainstream New Testament in the letters of Paul, is language that comes from the very same world of thought. Paul writes that our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the principalities, against the powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this age, against spiritual forces of wickedness in the heavenly places. He speaks of the ruler of the power of the air. He speaks of the rulers of this age who did not understand and who, in their ignorance, crucified the Lord of glory. This is not fringe material. This is the Apostle Paul, in the foundational documents of Christianity, describing a world governed by hostile spiritual rulers stationed in the heavens between humanity and God, using vocabulary that would have been instantly recognizable across the whole ancient world we have just surveyed. And there is one more body of evidence that sits right between the ancient world and the New Testament, and it matters because it shows the pattern intensifying rather than fading as history moved toward the first century. In the centuries just before Jesus, Jewish writers produced a whole literature of apocalyptic visions, texts like the Book of Enoch, that describe the heavens as populated by ranks of angelic beings, some faithful and some fallen, and describe a class of watchers who descended, corrupted the earth, and were bound and imprisoned for it, while their influence continued to work through hostile spirits left behind in the world. This literature describes a cosmos of layered heavens, each with its own inhabitants, and a real struggle playing out among the powers above, between those loyal to the highest God and those in rebellion. By the time we reached the world of the Gnostics and Paul, the Jewish tradition itself had developed an elaborate picture of ruling spiritual powers stationed in the heavens, some of them hostile, standing between humanity and the throne of God. The idea did not arrive in the New Testament from outside. It had been growing within Judaism itself, fed by the same ancient currents flowing through the whole region. So step back now and look at the full pattern we have assembled. Mesopotamia, with its swarm of intercepting spirits of the air and threshold; Egypt, with its guarded gates and its cosmos under perpetual siege; Persia, with its organized army of dark powers arrayed against the soul; Greece, with its populated air of intermediate daimones standing between earth and heaven; the Gnostics, with their archons guarding the spheres to keep souls trapped; and the New Testament itself, with its principalities and powers and rulers of darkness in high places. 6 traditions spread across the entire ancient world, and every one of them describes the same basic thing. The region between the human being and the ultimate divine is not empty and open. It is occupied and ruled, and the rulers are not friendly. Now we can ask the real question: why? Why does this specific fear appear so widely, so independently, in cultures that in many cases had little or no direct contact? There are only a handful of serious explanations, and it is worth walking through them honestly rather than jumping to the most dramatic one. The first explanation is diffusion. Perhaps the idea simply spread. The ancient world was more connected than we often assume, through trade routes, conquests, and the movement of peoples, and ideas traveled along those routes. Persian ideas influenced Judaism during the exile. Greek philosophy spread across the whole Mediterranean after Alexander. Egyptian and Mesopotamian concepts mingled for millennia. So, part of the resemblance is surely real historical contact, one culture's fears seeping into another's. This explains a great deal, especially in the tightly connected Mediterranean world where the Gnostics and Paul were writing. But diffusion cannot explain everything, because the pattern appears in places and times too separated for direct borrowing to account for all of it. Which brings the second explanation. Perhaps this fear reflects something universal about the human mind itself. Human beings everywhere experience life as governed by forces they cannot see or control: sickness, death, misfortune, the sense of being subject to powers larger than themselves. Perhaps every culture, facing that experience, naturally personifies those forces as ruling powers, and naturally imagines the space between themselves and the ultimate good as crowded with intermediaries, because that is simply how the human mind makes sense of a life that so often feels controlled from outside. On this reading, the archons are a mirror. They are humanity's universal experience of powerlessness projected onto the heavens. And then there is the third explanation, the one this channel exists to take seriously even while holding it carefully, that the reason so many separate cultures independently describe the same thing is that they were all, in their different languages and images, describing something that is actually there. That the ancients were not inventing a fear out of nothing, nor merely borrowing it from one another, but were each catching sight, through their own cultural lens, of a real structural feature of existence. That the space between the human being and the ultimate source genuinely is occupied by intermediate powers with an interest in human beings remaining where they are. On this reading, the convergence is not a coincidence and not merely a psychological mirror. It is what you would expect if many different watchmen, standing on many different towers, all reported seeing the same thing on the horizon. It is worth being clear and honest here. The safe, mainstream answer is a mixture of the first two, diffusion and universal psychology, and that mixture genuinely does explain a great deal. No responsible look at this can pretend a third explanation is proven, because it is not. But it is worth noticing what even the safe explanations concede. They concede that this fear is one of the most widespread and persistent ideas in the entire history of human religion. That across the ancient world, from the Nile to the Tigris to the Aegean to the Ganges, human beings kept arriving at the conviction that they were hemmed in by unseen rulers standing between them and the light. Whatever the ultimate cause, that conviction is one of the deepest and most recurrent things our species has ever believed. And there is a fourth possibility that deserves a mention, because it sits underneath the other three. Perhaps what the ancients were describing was not gods in the sky at all, but something closer to a description of the human condition itself, encoded in the only language they had. Perhaps they looked at how human beings are ruled from within and without, by fear, by appetite, by the invisible pressures of a society and a world that shapes us before we can choose, by all the forces that keep a person asleep and obedient and never asking what lies beyond. And they gave those forces faces and thrones and names and called them rulers. On this reading, the archons are neither literal sky beings nor a meaningless projection, but a genuine insight into the machinery of human bondage, dressed in the mythological clothing of its age. And this channel has explored in other videos how uncomfortably well that ancient description of invisible controlling powers maps onto the very real systems that shape human attention and desire today. That reading has a sharp edge to it, because it means the ancients may have been describing something true and something still present, even if the specific picture of winged rulers on heavenly thrones was the metaphor rather than the mechanism. The trap they feared may be real and may be operating right now, even if it wears a different face than the one they painted. And that leaves a question worth carrying away, whichever explanation you find most convincing. If nearly every ancient culture, independently and in its own voice, looked up at the space between themselves and the divine and saw it occupied by rulers who did not want them to pass, then either humanity shares a single universal shadow it has been projecting onto the sky since the beginning, or the watchmen on all those separate towers were seeing something real. And the only thing that has actually changed in the modern world is that we finally stopped looking up and stopped asking who exactly has been standing between us and the light the whole time.